Hey, what's up? Last Layer King here. Today I'm going to go over another application of memoing the entire cube to a U-move. In my last advanced weak swap video, I went over how to do that if you do triple weak swap. The idea is that if you do triple weak swap, all of the edges will be set up a U-move away from being solved, and if you memo edges first, then you can memo corners to a U-move, and then the entire cube will be a U-move away from being solved. Double weak swap is a similar case, but instead of having all three weak swap pieces set up to a U-move, we only have two of them set up to a U-move. So if this happens, because you're doing double weak swap and the cube has parity, you'll get a parity target. If you did triple weak swap, you wouldn't get a parity target. So normally, if you do double weak swap and get a parity target, like in this case here, we've got the buffer piece weak swapped in UL and the UL piece weak swapped in UF. The parity target is here. Normally what you would do is do a comm to cycle the parity target to the second weak swap piece. And this will give you a UB-UL swap. However, an alternative way of solving this, if you wanted to set the cube up to a U-move, would be to send this piece to the triple weak swap location, that being UR. And then if we do this, then we'll want to memorize all the corners to a U-move and then finish the cube with a U-move. So in this case here, we got the same sort of case on edges, and if we wanted to show how a solve would look like, other than the execution of the first few edge commutators, memorization for edges would go just as it normally would if you're doing double weak swap. We'll get this double weak swap and a parity target, and then we'll memo corners to a U-move, and in solving them, we will solve them like this. So we'll send this piece to here, so that they're both a U-move away, and then this is sort of like the new buffer piece because it goes to UBR, which is a U-move away from the buffer, so I'll cycle break it to here. And this piece goes to here. And now we have this corner twist here, so we'll do the two twist alg. And now all the corners are U-move away. So the last algorithm for edges would be cycling this odd target to UR. And then we'll do a U2 instead of a U to finish the cube. One thing to note is that when you're doing this type of double weak swap setup into a U-move, your last algorithm will likely be a comm ending on the UR piece. So it's good to know which cases have algorithms that end in U prime. So this case here, we have buffer to here, which ends in a U prime. And the significance is that that means the U prime is going to cancel. So this case is actually going to be a 7 mover. So it's good to know what's going to cancel and what's not. And if there are some cases where you can do an alternate alg to cancel the move, that might be useful. So for this case here, buffer to here, generally I would do an R prime setup into this comm on the M slice. However, another way of solving this case is like this, which happens to end in a U prime. So if we have this case with the double weak swap with all the corners memorized to a U move, this becomes a 7 mover. Now you might question, because we have to do an extra comm to set up the edges to be a U move away, is this more efficient than solving the cube normally? Well, let's take a look at this. If we cycle this piece to here like we would normally, we'll find that out of the 3 edge targets that aren't the buffer, 2 of them are solved and 1 of them is unsolved. If we instead cycle this piece up to here to set up an O-perm, now all 3 edge targets are a U-move away from being solved. So just by that intuition, it would be better. And in fact, on average, it is better by about half an alg. Because you're solving the corners so differently if you're memoing to a U-move than if memoing normally, the variance in the number of algs is pretty significant. And it is possible that memoing to a U-move will cause you to add an alg to the solve if you do this technique on double weak swap. However, it's also possible to reduce the number of algs by up to 2. This technique really does not affect the edge memorization at all, because you're just memoing a double weak swap and a parity target. The point at which you have to either commit to memorizing the cube to a U-move or memorizing corners normally is during corner memorization, and I want to take some time to explore how that works. I'm going to go over this next section assuming your buffer is UBL. If your buffer is UFR, then things will work similarly, but the pieces themselves will be a bit different. So while memorizing corners, you'll want to memorize them in such a way to avoid as many cycle breaks as you can. And because you have two options, you can actually affect the number of cycle breaks on the cube, because you can either memorize the corners normally or memorize them to a U-move. So if you're memorizing corners normally, then your effective buffer is UBL, and if you're memorizing to a U-move, your effective buffer is UBR. If the first corner target you hit is UBL, then if you're memorizing to a U-move, you can just solve it to UFL, and you have avoided a cycle break. If the first target you hit on the top paste is UBR, then if you're memorizing the corners to a U-move, this is now your buffer piece and you have to cycle break. So by memorizing to a U-move, you'll have added an extra cycle break. So therefore, if your first corner target on top is UBR, then it is less likely that memorizing corners to a U-move will reduce the number of algs you'll have in the solve. But if your first corner target you hit is the buffer piece, UBL, then memorizing the corners to a U-move will increase the probability that you'll be able to save one or more algs on the solve. However, just hitting a top layer piece does not mean you have to commit to how you're memorizing corners. There are a few rules you can follow that will allow you to gain more information about corners before having to commit to either memorizing them to a U-move or solving them. If you ever hit the buffer piece, you'll just want to weak swap it to UFL like you would normally do if you're doing corner weak swap. If you do this, then you can either solve corners normally by treating the buffer piece in UBL as just being a weak swapped piece, or you can treat it as being solved in the UFL location because it's a U-move away. You haven't committed yet. And this even goes further. So if after hitting the buffer piece and sending it to UFL, if you hit the UFL piece, what you can do is send it to UFR. In that scenario, if you're memorizing the corners to a U-move, you now have a second piece that is a U-move away from being solved, and the cube is basically in a valid state and you didn't do anything inefficient. But you can also solve the cube normally by treating the buffer as being weak swapped in UFL, and then having cycle broke the UFL piece. Another scenario is if your first corner target that you hit is UBR, you're just going to send it to UBR in the correct orientation. If you're solving the corners normally, then it's just a solved piece. And if you're solving to a U-move, then you're simply cycle breaking on UBR and the cube is still in a valid state. So there's a whole set of decision trees that you can go down in determining whether or not you want to solve the cube normally or solve the cube to a U-move. And I'm going to go over 3 of these decision trees. The recommended decision tree to choose is going to depend on whether or not you know LTCT. So LTCT is a algorithm set for 3-blind which will solve a parity target and a corner twist at the same time. There are 252 cases in LTCT, and I know a few blinders have learned some or all of LTCT. The significance of LTCT is if you have parity, then there's a possibility that you'll have a corner twist and you'll be able to do an LTCT algorithm to have a more efficient solution. But if you memorize the cube to a U-move, you won't get parity on corners, which means you won't be able to do LTCT. So if you know some or all of LTCT, then memoing the corners to a U-move will be less effective in reducing the number of algs in the solve. The first decision tree I want to go over is if you do not know LTCT. And it works like this. If the first corner target you hit is not UBR, that means you want to memorize all the corners to a U-move. If you hit UBR, then you're obviously going to want to send it to UBR in order to maintain flexibility of what you can do. And then if the second piece you hit on the top is UFR, then you're going to solve it to UFR and then solve all the corners normally. If the second piece you hit is anything other than UFR, then you want to solve all the corners to a U-move. And then solving the initial UBR piece to UBR is a cycle break. If your first target is not UBR, then there is a significant probability that your solve will be more efficient than if you solve the corners normally. If your first target is UBR and your second target is something else, then on average your solve will be very, very slightly more efficient. There are a couple cases where the number of algorithms on average will be slightly higher, but it is so slight that you'll gain more benefit by eliminating the parity alg and solving the entire rest of corners with just comms and potentially twists. So if you hit UBR and then UFR, then solve corners normally. any other piece order, you want to solve all the corners to a U-move. Now, if you know LTCT, I'm going to go over two different decision trees. The first one is a simple one, and the second one is a more complicated one. So the first decision tree is very, very simple. If the first target you hit is UBR, you solve all the corners normally. If the first target you hit is anything else, you solve to a U-move. It's as simple as that. It's very easy to learn, but there are a few scenarios where it's potentially suboptimal. And that's where the second decision tree comes in. If you want to be very optimal in your decision of whether or not to memorize to a U-move, then I'm going to go over all the scenarios. So if your first top layer target is UBR, then if your second top layer target is either UFR or UFL, then you'll want to memorize the corners normally. If your second top layer corner target is UBL, you're going to shoot it to UFL, and at this point you still haven't committed. So if your third target is UFL, then you're going to memorize to a U-move. If your third top layer target is UFR, you're just going to solve it, and then you're going to solve the corners normally. And you'll have this weak swap with the UBL to UFL swap. If your first corner target is either UFL or UFR, then you have to commit immediately, and we're going to commit to memorizing the cube to a U-move. If the first top layer corner target is UBL, then we're going to shoot it to UFL. And then if the second top layer target is either UFL or UFR, then we're going to memorize all the corners to a U-move. If the second top layer corner target is UBR, then if the third top layer target is UFL, we're going to memorize the cube to a U-move. If the third target is instead UFR, then we're going to solve the corners normally. I know it's a somewhat complicated decision tree, but it is what I have found to be optimal. So if you want to do something super optimal, then that's the decision tree you'll want to use. Also bear in mind, if you happen to notice there's a solved corner in the top face somewhere, that may affect whether or not you want to solve the corners normally or to a U-move. You'll probably be more likely to want to solve them normally. So just take that into account if you happen to get a scramble with the solved top layer corner. If you're using a UFR buffer, then all the pieces in the decision tree you'll treat as a U-move away. So wherever UBR shows up in the decision tree, you're now treating that as UFL. Whenever UFL shows up in the decision tree, you're treating it as UBR. And wherever you see UFR in the decision tree, it's now UBL. And whenever you see UBL in the decision tree, it becomes UFR. That's all I've got for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will catch you in the next video.